what we've come to understand grief as. But I am a adult therapist at Thrive. I've been there a little over 3 years. I'm an LCSW, and I work with adults in individual counseling. I co-facilitate 2 grief groups as well as an anger management group at Thrive. So I've been able to compare the power of individual counseling with group counseling and the differences between them. And Thrive's grief group has been running over 5 years, and when the therapist left the agency who was running it, I decided to take over because I had my own personal experience with loss growing up, losing my grandparents, family pets, other relatives, and so Sam graciously joined me in co-facilitating our in-person grief group, and that's who I'm here with tonight, so I'll let her introduce herself as well.
Thank you, and I also have a soft voice, so if you can't hear me, please just give me a wave. My name is Sam, and I've been at Thrive for about 3 years. I co-facilitate an anger management group with Hattie and the grief group that we have in person on Tuesday nights. I mostly work with adult clients at Thrive, a lot of clients that are coming in with trauma, depression, anxiety, so kind of all across the board. And before that, I was at Sarah's Inn in Forest Park working in the domestic violence field. Some of you might be familiar with their organization. So yeah, we're really excited to be here tonight at Brookdale. Thank you all for coming out, and we will get started.
We'll start with this quote here. Grief is like the ocean. It comes in waves ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm and sometimes it is overwhelming. All we can do is learn to swim, by Vicki Harrison. So to start us off, I just want to ask everybody here, what words would you use to describe grief? Roller coaster? Awful? Is that what you said? Awful. Mm-hmm. Forgetful.
Sometimes I forgot that my mother passed away when I called it.
Yeah.
So I think that's
Yeah. Yeah. That's a common one, right? So forgetfulness, kind of being reminded, those unpleasant reminders. Regret. Mm-hmm.
My father died. Regret. Yeah. Saying about it.
That, anger. Loss, right? Avoidance. Mm-hmm. Loneliness and pain. Not happy words, right? Any other words come to mind? Sneaky. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And what's one thing that you're hoping to get out of today's presentation?
There's always something
Something new? Yeah, maybe a new perspective or new insight. Thank you. Yeah, we will definitely talk about coping in different ways that we can self-soothe or take care of ourselves around grief.
Ways to be there for someone.
Yeah, that's a big topic, right? I think I hear the choir show starting. It's so cute. Yeah. Yeah, ways to be there for someone, ways to be there for ourselves. Anything else? Preparing for loss. Yeah, if there is such a thing, right? Yeah. I think that's something that we all try to do to some extent, especially if we've had previous losses, right? So then we try to gear ourselves up for the next next one so it doesn't hit so hard. But there often we find there is no way to really fully prepare because it's always something unexpected. That's a great list. Thank you all. Oh, yes.
I found that new loss can trigger old unresolved loss.
Yeah. Yeah, that happens a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have a good list here, and I think you all bring up very, very universal feelings and issues that we come across after we lose somebody. So we will just quickly talk about the difference between grief and mourning, and you all are probably already aware of this, but grief is the suffering the loss, right? How it affects us. So grief is our response to loss, and then mourning is the behavior that comes from loss, usually in rituals, right? Wearing black is a form of mourning, and so that's just a slight difference that I'd like us all to be aware of as we're talking about grief.
Okay, so as Hattie kind of introduced at the beginning, we're going to be talking a little bit about normal versus complicated grief. But first we're going to start off with a question for you all. So if we look up here, it says, which of the following grief-related behaviors is abnormal? A is a father who visits his son's grave every morning. B is a woman who refuses to part with her deceased mother's belongings. C is a woman who avoids the restaurant where she met her deceased husband. And D is a man who experiences intense emotions two years after his daughter's death. And E is none of the above. What do we think? I hear E. Is that the consensus? Mm-hmm. Right. As this quote says, each person's grief journey is unique as a fingerprint or a snowflake. So something to think about with normal grief, which as many of us have already described, there's a lot of emotions that might come out of normal grief. Sadness, of course, but also anger, guilt, maybe even relief if we had a loved one who was sick for a very long time, right, and they're no longer in pain. So it can be very complicated. It's not just sadness or depression that we always think of when we talk about grief. And then there's also that kind of collective grief that we all go through. It might be as a community, it might be as a nation, it might be as the world, right? So it's an individual process that we each and every one of us go through, but we can also, go through the grieving process together and mourn together. So that collective grief is also something that is important to keep in mind. Typically, what we see clinically is that this normal grief should resolve after about 18 months, right? I mean, there's no time limit on grief, right? But those really extreme feelings of grief and those extreme emotions should start to resolve, after a while. We might be able to get back to work. We might be able to get back to those daily tasks that we need to do. But with complicated grief, there might be some other factors that are contributing to make it really hard to kind of start to heal from that. Another thing that comes up very commonly when we talk about grief and normal grief is the 5 stages of grief. But this is not a linear process. We might not hit every stage. We might hit multiple stages at once, right? So again, it's a very individual process that we go through. For those of us that might not be able to see, these 5 stages include denial, so that might be just kind of avoiding thinking about it at all, talking about it, not really accepting that as part of our reality. Anger, frustration, irritation, anxiety, and that might also be projected onto others, right? Loved ones, where we're not really able to handle it, so we kind of present it to others. bargaining, right? So searching to find meaning. A lot of those like, why me, why them, why now questions might come up. Depression, just feeling like we've lost hope. We might want to escape, we might isolate, right? And then acceptance is the end goal of just starting to accept this as a part of our reality, and having it become a part of our lives moving forward. This is quite small, so I apologize. But some signs of complicated grief. So, you know, it's happening once that normal grief becomes severely long, right, in duration. And it really starts to impact our daily functioning. We might not be able to do our jobs, parent, maintain relationships, right? All of that kind of day-to-day kind of goes out the window. There are certain risk factors that go along with this as well, especially if we've already been dealing with a lot in our lives. It's hard to kind of stack something on top of that, right? Also, the nature of the loss can make this complicated. So if we don't have a lot of answers as to why this loss happened, or if it happened to a person that seems like it, you know, was taken too soon, for example, right? That can be very hard to resolve. But it really looks like kind of that constant feeling of sadness, that constant preoccupation with that grief or that loss. We might turn to different coping mechanisms that we didn't before that can become unhealthy over time, such as using substances, radical lifestyle changes, right? Just kind of yearning to be with the person who is no longer here. And then, yeah, as we were talking about as one of our goals for today, is to talk through treatment and coping. With that main goal being of integrating the grief into our life. I don't think it's fair to say we ever get over a loss. I think that's a kind of a cruel way of thinking about loss, actually. So we have to find ways, hopefully, to integrate that person still into our lives, and that can be in many different ways. Some of us might still talk to the person who's no longer here. We might write to them. We might use prayer or other rituals or traditions or ceremonies to keep them as a part of our life. Of course, there's professional ways of coping, seeking out group or individual therapy, journaling, right? Writing letters to a lost loved one, for example. Accepting and releasing emotions. All of those quote-unquote negative emotions are just as valid as some positive ones that might come up as well. Happy memories, right? Being able to laugh with our family members. And then wanting to reconnect and reintegrate into our communities and into our lives again, right? So we might not want to do some of the activities we used to do. It might not feel fair to keep living our lives while that person is no longer here. And so we find ways of trying to kind of reconnect to those old things.
So I want to pause here and just see if anyone has any immediate thoughts or reflections on what Sam has talked about so far. Oh yeah, that's fine. That's good. Okay. Any reflections?
Yes. I'd like to add a couple of things to the list you did have up there.
Would you like me to pull it up?
Yeah. I found that support groups and self-help books have been very helpful.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that. We're going to talk more about support groups and how they can help, specifically around grief.
Would you mind going back to the slide before this one? You had between the 40 and 60%. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, so this is specifically talking about people who are experiencing complicated grief, not normal grief. And so there's a high percentage, 40 to 60% of people experiencing complicated grief that think about suicide because the yearning to be with their lost loved one is so great. Yeah, so you're typically seeing higher levels of distress and severity in symptoms with complicated grief to the point where it's sort of all-consuming and difficult to focus on other things. And I think this is more common too with loss for those loss around unexplained circumstances or mystery, right? Or we don't have all the answers. It can be easier to sort of slip into this searching for answers place and intense yearning. But great question, thank you.
Is there such a thing as complex grief that's different than complicated grief?
Not in the DSM, but what are you thinking of when you think complex?
The image of like a complicated relationship and then loss and sort of the processing in that instance. Is that complicated grief or is that just something?
You're saying if you have a complicated relationship to the person? Yeah, there's not, I don't know personally of a term to describe that, but I think that's a good point that you bring up where that might complicate the grieving process, right? Because now your feelings for someone, and I think even when you have a good relationship with someone, it's still not black and white, right? There's often residual anger or guilt, or somebody earlier said regret about the relationship or what we could have done. And so I think we want to normalize having multiple emotions or even conflicting emotions when experiencing loss.
I think some of the complexities of that kind of loss with unresolved issues, you begin to feel that you don't have an opportunity to bring resolution in those relationships. So
Yeah.
it tends to be open-ended in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we'll get to in a bit, but something that comes up a lot in groups.
On the risk factors, the demographics, are you saying those people in those categories have a higher chance of complicated grief? And what's lower SES?
Social economic status. Does anyone have any thoughts about the stages of grief? Maybe we can go back to that quickly. Have people's experiences been sort of one at a time, one stage really jumping out at them, or does it feel more like the right picture where maybe you're feeling everything all at once, or just one thing on the heels of another? Maybe something to come back to in the Q&A. So I'm going to share Rosie's stories now. This is not a real client, by the way. I made this up, but it's a common experience. So Rosie, let me see if there's a less awkward way to stand here and talk. Rosie lost her husband of 45 years 6 months ago. Since then, she has trouble eating and sleeping and has difficulty getting out of bed in the morning. Once an avid gardener and swimmer, Rosie doesn't find the same joy in it that she used to. Her friends were sympathetic at first, but now seem less understanding. They tell her to move on and encourage her to think about the future and the people who still need her. This causes Rosie to feel even more alone and is starting to see people less and less. Rosie decides to see a therapist and talk about her feelings. She explores the direct loss as well as other losses, including her role as a wife, a sense of normal and daily routine, and facing an uncertain future. Her therapist encourages her to journal her thoughts and feelings outside of session and explore ways in which Rosie can find meaning through the loss. Over the next 6 months, Rosie finds relief in having a safe space to talk and rediscover herself. She picks up gardening again and joins a weekly book club. As she continues to process the loss, Rosie finds that grief is not something you ever get over, but rather something you learn to live with. Slowly but surely, Rosie regains confidence in her ability to connect with herself, others, and her broader community. So we'll come back to Rosie's story and how it can maybe connect to your personal experiences with loss and what healing looks like for you all. But we'll just take a minute to share about the grief groups that we run at Thrive. So I run a virtual grief group on Wednesdays from 10 to 11:30 a.m. and then with Sam we run the in-person grief group on Tuesdays from 6 to 7:30 p.m. And there's a bit of a pre-screening process just to make sure everyone in group is a good fit for group, but we have our information here if you're interested, and we can talk more about it after group. Just wanted to share that. So thinking about the common themes in group, right? What sort of topics come up when we're talking about grief? So you can see some of the themes here: guilt and shame, isolation, changes in role and self-identity, right, like we saw in Rosie's story, changes in our family relationships, loss of traditions. As people in our circles pass, maybe those were the people that always hosted Thanksgiving dinner, right, or they were the ones that cooked, and now who does it? And there can be a lot of change in family dynamics as a result of loss. And also navigating different reactions to loss among family and loved ones, right? Because this is something that comes up a lot, is that people grieve differently. And we might not like how other people grieve. We might even find it offensive or insulting. Or people might not understand the way that we grieve. And so navigating those differences, it can be a stress too. And then just to end on a positive note here, before we go into Q&A, these are some of the positive themes that we find in group support, grief group support groups. A sense of community and belonging, relating to one another's experience and validation, knowing that you're not alone. I think that's probably the number one takeaway for a lot of people, because grief can be isolating. Setting aside time to focus on the grieving process. I think so often we're so set on continuing our life and moving forward and taking care of our responsibilities that grief becomes this unmanageable mess. And so in the group space, we talk about how we can be intentional about setting aside time to really process the grief and give it the time that it deserves. And then lastly, just having a safe and non-judgmental space to share our experience, right? Share our feelings without feeling like we need to button up or put on a brave face for people. Okay. Yeah. So I want to open it up now to any questions and discussions. Maybe we can start